I have a 9mm in my hand. I'm sitting on the edge of my bed. I'm trying to find the courage to take my life. My mom walks into the room, horrified by what she sees, runs out and calls 911, at which time the OPP are dispatched, and I met Constable Scott McLeod. That's where my story begins. Mr. Chancellor, Mr. Board Chair, Mr. President, graduates, guests, Marie. I was born in Midland, Ontario in an average home. I had an older brother and a younger sister. And if you would have thought that I would have ended up finding myself in the streets of East Vancouver, you would have been wrong. I didn't project that life for me. I was a happy, seemingly well-adjusted young man. But life has a way of lifing us, and at the tender age of 35, my father passed away. And I think that fracture went really deep inside me, and I can remember feeling afraid. The man that replaced him, it would have been hard to fill my father's shoes, but the man who came next paled in comparison. He was a violent, abusive alcoholic. And so I had this fractured sense of self-worth, and I was trying desperately to find my place in the world. At 9 years old, I began experimenting with drugs. Not because I was curious about drugs, because I was seeking escape and acceptance within a group of older, cooler kids, and I was willing to sell myself short. I went home under the influence, and for the first time in my life, I felt safe again since Dad was gone. That became a repeating pattern for the next 15 years of my life. We later moved from Midland to Barrie, and life for me got harder and harder into my teens. By the time I was 15, I was non-compliant at home and having trouble in high school, and I ran away from home. There was a lot of family conflict, and it wasn't a place that was really a good place for me to be anymore. But at 15 years old, I didn't have the skill set to really do a good job at taking care of myself, so more poor decisions followed. By the time I was 16, I went to jail for the first time. And by the time I was 17, I was experimenting with drugs intravenously. And I left the Barrie area for the West. The year was 1986. I was in my late teens, and I landed in downtown Vancouver and stayed for a while in a rooming house. But the poor decisions continued to plague my life, and I went from smoking pot and using alcohol to finding myself in the severe grip of heroin addiction. The lowest point of my life, I found myself pushing a shopping cart around Vancouver's downtown east side, collecting cans and bottles to support a drug dependency. All the while thinking, I'm a good kid from a good family. How did this happen? Well, I was from a good family, and that was one of my saving graces, because when my time finally came for me to make a decision to stand up and be accountable for my life, I had people in my corner. I had my mom. And I reached out, and Mom scooped me up off the streets of Vancouver and brought me back here to Midhurst, where I lived. Which brings us back to that fate-filled night. I continued to struggle with mental health and with addiction. And I couldn't seem to get a grip on it. I couldn't seem to find the opening. I knew that there was more inside me, but I couldn't find it on my own. The night I was finally at the end of my rope, I met a compassionate and empathic police officer named Constable Scott McLeod from the OPP. And I believe in many ways that Scott was far ahead of the mental health bell curve that we see policing embracing today, because he saw a man in crisis, not a man in threat. And what I understand today is that that call could have gone either way. A man with a weapon. Instead, Scott used empathy and compassion and he defused the situation, ordered an ambulance where I was taken to Royal Victoria Hospital and my life was saved. I took that opportunity and parlayed it into an opportunity to go to drug and alcohol treatment, and I ended up in the city of Belleville. And after 6 months of drug treatment, I was coerced into going back to college. Any of you were coerced here? Yes, I know. But something wonderful happened for me when I darkened the doorway of that school. You see, I went in confused and afraid and didn't feeling like I could fit, and I didn't feel like I had the tools to do it, but they began to shape and work with me. And they knocked off the rough edges, and they continued to encourage me, and it was tough. It was hard for me on multiple different levels, but I persevered. And 4 years later, I was sitting where you are today, graduating college with a 3.94 GPA. I took that experience and I went out into the world, and with my combined past experience and transferable skills, I did extremely well in the business community. In less than 12 years, leveraging a technology.com explosion in Vancouver, in less than 12 years, I went from a kid pushing a shopping cart in the downtown east side to finding myself on the cover of Maclean's magazine as a celebrated Canadian entrepreneur. I know, right? One of the things that I consider when I look back at the trajectory of my story is we see where it went right. I had that mom, I had that police officer, I had that family, I had that uncle. Those people that were in my corner to help me get through that transformation. And that opened the doorway for me. And I became very curious about 5 years ago about what I could do to pay it forward. And I remember a conversation that I had with my Uncle Donnie in front of an elevator at a detox facility in Toronto. I said, I don't know why God has spared my life, but I assume at some point I will get shown why. But I believe, and I believe all of us are here for a specific purpose. In 2011, I was working with a gentleman named Dr. Sean Richardson, and I began asking a question about legacy and about contribution and about paying it forward. The thing that keeps me awake at night is how many kids across this great country of ours have all the opportunity that I have, but they don't have my mom. And they haven't met Scott, and they have no one in their corner. They have no one to champion them to say, I believe in you, kid. You have it in you to succeed. And I said to my friend Sean, I want to do something to support those young people, those people who were just like me, those people who are on the street or at risk of being on the street, homeless young people. And my friend Sean said to me, he says, well, if you want to raise awareness for things, Canadians have a model for that. They run, walk, cycle, skip across the country. It's kind of our thing. He said, why don't you walk across Canada for youth homelessness? At which point I replied, why don't you walk across Canada? Kind of busy this week. But then he said something brilliant. He said, Joe, you're trying to push for change. You're trying to open awareness. You're trying to break down barriers. You're trying to destigmatize the issue. You're trying to educate. You're trying to push for change. He said, why don't you take that symbol of homelessness, a shopping cart, and push that across Canada and call it the push for change? Well, that's in fact what we decided to do in 2011, and then we spent the next 4 years building the campaign. In 2013, I was drawn back here to Barrie to be with Marie. We had reconnected after 28 years. We had fallen back in love. And yes, in April, we did get married. And Marie is the love of my life. She's my partner in crime, and she's my anchor. She's also the campaign director for the Push for Change. As you can imagine, walking 9,000 kilometers across the second widest country on the planet requires a tremendous amount of work. So we began doing that work. We began building community champions. We began reaching out. We began doing the hard work of getting physically ready. And on May 1st, I began that walk. And it took 42 days after I left Cape Spear, but eventually I reached the Port aux Basques ferry terminal, 917 kilometers away. Nobody told me what the weather was going to be like in Newfoundland in May. Suffice to say, it's not like Ontario. Then we landed in Sydney Harbour and were met with the Cape Breton Regional Police and Chief Peter McIsaac. And we were escorted around the city. And last week, I finished walking across Cape Breton Island. I'm 1,080 kilometers into a 9,000 kilometer walk across the greatest country in the world. Why? Because I believe it's a worthwhile endeavor. Why? Because I believe in young people. Why? Because I believe anything that is predictable is preventable. That we can prevent, reduce, and end youth homelessness in this country, and I'm determined to continue that walk. When I leave here tonight, we'll get back on an airplane, land in Sydney, drive back to base camp, and we'll pick that shopping cart up again tomorrow morning and begin walking towards Antigonish. And on July 1st, we'll be in Halifax, and on September the 22nd, we'll walk into Ontario. And on New Year's Eve, we'll be back here in Barrie. And I am as sure of that as I am that the sun rose this morning, because I'm determined. You see, I believe that inside each and every one of us is an unlimited, untapped potential. And so I urge you, graduates, to find the thing that you're passionate about. Find the thing that fires you up. Find the thing that wakes you up in the morning, that gets your little feet moving towards that thing that you feel is worthwhile, towards your push for change. Because when you begin to access and move forward in relentless action, that's when the world begins to unfold in extraordinary ways. I believe that we are at a time in history when in the not too distant future they will call this before, as each one of us wakes up to what's possible, that infinite possibility inside every single one of us, and picks up our opus and march forward with courageous action. We can and we will change the world. But not a moment before we change ourselves. And the reason I believe that is the first time I had that idea, I was sitting on a park bench in downtown East Vancouver, a broken, homeless drug addict. I want to thank the university, Chancellor, Mr. President, esteemed staff, colleagues, for this extraordinary honor and award, and I pledge to you to use it and extract whatever I can in the service of others. In closing, graduates, I will say to you what Ron Bonesteel said to me at my graduation: life owes you nothing. And for some of you, it's going to give you less. It's going to tug your hair, it's going to scratch your face, and it's going to knock you down. And from someone who's been knocked down, I can tell you the only instruction I can give you when you get knocked down is to get back up and keep walking. Thanks.